My daughter called me cold and controlling for not letting her borrow more money. She told her mother and stepbrother I was the reason she felt oppressed, and they all laughed behind my back in the house I paid for. I didn't defend myself. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before we continue, support us by clicking on the like button, tell us in the comments section where you are watching us from, and click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss our big story tomorrow. Now let me tell you what happened from the beginning. She leaned against the kitchen counter like she owned the place and said it flatly, not even angry, just certain. You're cold. You've always been controlling. The refrigerator hummed behind her, steady and indifferent, and my coffee sat untouched in my hand. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just said it the way someone states a fact they think everyone else already agrees on. I remember the exact way the light from the window hit the edge of the counter, the way her foot hooked around the leg of the stool, casual and bored. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict that had already been reached without me. She followed it up quickly, like she'd practiced. She needed money again. Not for an emergency, not for something unexpected, just to get ahead, as she put it, as if that phrase alone justified the ask. I asked how much without looking at her, still staring at the coffee like it might cool fast enough to give me an excuse to drink instead of answer. When I hesitated, just a beat too long, her expression changed. That was when she added the word oppressive, like it was a diagnosis. I nodded once, said I'd think about it, and she rolled her eyes, already done with me. Within a month, I would make a decision that none of them saw coming. But that morning, all I did was set the mug down and leave the room. The house had felt crowded for a long time before that, even though no one had added furniture or extra bodies. It was my house on paper, every payment traced back to my account, every repair scheduled by me, every tax bill addressed to my name. But living in it had started to feel like visiting a place where I was tolerated rather than welcomed. My daughter, her mother, and her stepbrother moved through the rooms with an ease I no longer had, as if comfort itself had shifted allegiance. I told myself it was normal, that this was what support looked like when you did it right. Quiet, invisible, unthanked. Still, something in the air that morning felt altered, like a pressure change you don't notice until your ears start to ache. I didn't always say yes right away, but I always said yes eventually, and that distinction had slowly lost its meaning. Tuition gaps, car trouble, rent that was just for a few months. I covered it all, telling myself I was investing in stability, in family, in a future where none of this would be thrown back at me. I kept mental notes of amounts and dates, not because I expected repayment, but because part of me needed proof that I wasn't imagining the scale of it. That morning, after she walked away, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank app, a routine alert about a balance threshold I'd set years earlier. I dismissed it without opening, already tired in a way sleep never fixed. By lunchtime, the story had already moved ahead of me. I could hear voices drifting from the living room while I worked at the desk in my bedroom. The door half closed, but not enough to keep sound out. Her voice carried clearly, animated now, telling her mother that I used money to control people, and that living with me felt like being monitored. Her stepbrother laughed at something I couldn't quite make out, a short bark of amusement that cut sharper than anything she'd said to my face. I stayed where I was, staring at the email on my screen without reading it. I didn't defend myself then. I didn't even interrupt. I just sat there, aware that this moment would matter later, even if I didn't know how yet. Silence had been my strategy for years, a way to keep the peace without turning every disagreement into a trial. I believed that if I stayed calm long enough, the noise would burn itself out. But listening to them that afternoon, I realized silence had been translated into something else entirely. To them, it meant agreement or weakness. I wasn't sure which, and the difference no longer seemed important. I felt a familiar pull to step in, to explain the math, the limits, the reality of what I could and couldn't give. Instead, I checked the time, noted that it was only Tuesday, and closed my laptop. That delay, that choice to wait, would cost me more than I understood in that moment. 2 days later, the house settled back into its routine, as if nothing had been said at all. Dishes appeared in the sink and disappeared again without comment. Someone left the porch light on all night, and I turned it off in the morning without mentioning it. At breakfast, her stepbrother joked about landlords being parasites, glancing at me with a grin that dared me to react. I didn't. I asked if anyone wanted more coffee and refilled my mug. The utility bill arrived by email that afternoon, higher than usual, and I forwarded it to myself instead of printing it. Each small thing stacked quietly, like kindling laid with care. I spent that evening going through old files on my computer, not with any clear purpose at first. Receipts, statements, scanned contracts from years ago, evidence of a life built on responsibility and follow-through. Somewhere between a mortgage statement and a property tax receipt, a thought formed that I didn't push away. I owned this place outright in every sense that mattered. That fact hadn't changed, even if the way it was treated had. I closed the folder and stared at the dark reflection in the screen, recognizing the tired man looking back. I wasn't angry yet. I was something closer to resolve, though I didn't have language for it then. That night, as I lay in bed, laughter drifted down the hall again, softer this time, but no less pointed. I caught fragments, my name, the word dramatic, another laugh. I turned onto my side and stared at the wall, counting the faint cracks in the paint I'd paid to have redone last year. I didn't confront them. I didn't plan a speech. I just let the sound wash over me until it faded, and in that quiet, I accepted a truth I'd been circling for years. Generosity, when it becomes expected, stops being seen as kindness at all. By the weekend, nothing outward had changed, but internally, something had clicked into place. I moved through the house carefully, not to avoid anyone, but to observe without reacting. I noted how my daughter spoke about money as if it were a shared resource rather than something earned, how her mother framed my boundaries as emotional failings, how the stepbrother treated my restraint like an invitation to push harder. On Saturday morning, a friend texted me about meeting for lunch, and I declined without explanation. I needed the space to think, to sit with the discomfort instead of smoothing it over like I always did. I didn't make any declarations that week. I didn't issue warnings or ultimatums. Outwardly, I was the same quiet presence I'd always been, the one who paid bills and kept the lights on. Inwardly, though, I felt a door closing with a final, careful click. They thought my silence meant nothing had changed, that the balance of the house would remain tilted in their favor indefinitely. They were wrong, even if they wouldn't know it for a while. I went to bed that Sunday night knowing I wouldn't live like this forever, and that knowledge, more than anger, was what finally let me sleep. I heard my name through the wall, clear enough that there was no mistaking it, followed by a pause, and then laughter. Not loud laughter, nothing so careless, but the kind that slips out when people think they're safe from consequence. I stood in the hallway with my hand still on the doorknob, shoes half on, jacket unzipped, frozen in a posture that made me feel foolish the longer I stayed there. My daughter's voice carried first, casual and dismissive, explaining something about how I used money as leverage. Her stepbrother cut in with a sarcastic comment I couldn't quite hear, and then her mother laughed, sharp and approving. I didn't move. I just listened long enough to know this wasn't a misunderstanding. Within weeks, I would take an action that would permanently change how they spoke about me, but in that moment, all I did was quietly step back into my room and close the door. That was the night the house stopped feeling like mine, not because anything tangible had changed, but because something invisible had shifted out of alignment. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the sounds fade, trying to slow my breathing the way I'd taught myself years earlier during a different kind of stress. I wasn't angry yet. I was alert. There's a difference I'd learned the hard way. Anger makes noise inside you. Alertness sharpens everything instead. I replayed the fragments I'd heard, not to torture myself, but to understand the story they were telling when I wasn't in the room. It was a story where I was cold, controlling, and conveniently absent of any context that might complicate their narrative. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd previously dismissed as quirks or temporary friction. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room, then resumed with exaggerated normalcy once I sat down. The way my daughter spoke about the house, as if it were a neutral space rather than something tied to me at all. Her stepbrother started leaving his things spread out across common areas, shoes by the door, gym bag on the couch, like a subtle test of territory. I told myself not to read into it, even as I carefully stepped around belongings that weren't mine. I didn't confront anyone. I was still gathering information, even if I didn't yet admit that was what I was doing. 2 evenings later, I came home to find the kitchen rearranged. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. A cabinet I'd always used was now stocked differently, my usual mug pushed to the back, replaced by newer ones I hadn't bought. My daughter was at the table on her phone, and I asked, as evenly as I could, if she'd move things around. She shrugged without looking up and said it made more sense this way, like the decision had been obvious and unanimous. Her mother added from the living room that change was healthy and I shouldn't be so rigid. I nodded, opened a different cabinet, and felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with coffee. Money came up again that week, not directly, but in passing comments that carried an edge. The utility bill was higher, and when I mentioned it aloud, not accusingly, just noting it, her stepbrother joked that comfort cost money and maybe I should loosen up. My daughter chimed in that if I was stressed about finances, maybe I shouldn't have offered to help people in the first place. I didn't remind her that offering had slowly turned into expectation, that boundaries had been treated like betrayals. I paid the bill that night and saved the receipt in a folder on my desktop, labeling it with the date. It felt like a small, petty thing, but it grounded me. By the weekend, the atmosphere had settled into something tense but functional, the way a storm cloud lingers without breaking. We shared meals, exchanged surface-level conversation, and avoided anything that might expose the fault lines running underneath. On Saturday morning, I overheard my daughter on the phone, pacing the backyard and venting to someone about how oppressive it felt to live with someone who counted every dollar. I stood at the sink rinsing a plate that was already clean, letting the water run longer than necessary. I wanted to step outside and correct her, to explain the difference between awareness and control. Instead, I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly, knowing that explaining myself hadn't changed anything so far. That afternoon, a friend stopped by unexpectedly, someone who'd known me long enough to recognize when something was off. We sat on the porch while the others stayed inside, the screen door closed just enough to create a barrier. He joked about retirement plans, and then, more seriously, asked how things were going at home. I gave a vague answer about adjustments and family dynamics, and he watched me for a moment before saying, "You know, being generous doesn't mean being invisible." The comment landed heavier than he intended, I think, because he immediately tried to soften it. I laughed it off, but after he left, I sat there alone, staring at the yard I maintained and paid for, and felt the truth of it settle uncomfortably in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and pulled up the property records for the house. It wasn't suspicion at first, more like verification, the way you check a lock even when you know it's secure. My name was there alone, exactly as it had always been. No shared ownership, no hidden clauses. I closed the browser and leaned back in the chair, the glow of the screen fading as it went dark. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what that meant beyond legal terms. Ownership wasn't just about rights. It was about responsibility, and I'd been carrying that without authority for far too long. Sunday dinner was louder than usual, filled with forced cheer and exaggerated stories. At one point, her stepbrother joked about how nice it must be to have a sugar dad who never said no, and my daughter laughed, a quick, unthinking sound. I smiled tightly and continued eating, the taste of the food dulled by something sour underneath. I realized then that my silence had become part of the entertainment, a backdrop against which they performed their comfort. They didn't see restraint, they saw permission. I excused myself early and went for a walk, the cool air outside feeling like relief rather than cold. As I walked, I replayed the past few weeks with a clarity that surprised me. Every moment I'd brushed aside, every comment I'd minimized, lined up into something coherent and undeniable. This wasn't about a single request for money or an offhand insult. It was about a gradual erosion of respect, facilitated by my own reluctance to disrupt the peace. I knew then that continuing as I had been wasn't kindness, it was self-neglect. I didn't know yet what I would do, only that doing nothing was no longer an option. That realization carried a strange calm with it, like standing at the edge of a decision you haven't named but already feel committed to. When I returned home, the lights were on and voices drifted through the open windows, familiar and distant all at once. I paused on the walkway, keys in hand, and looked at the house as if seeing it from the outside for the first time. It stood solid and unchanged, bricks and mortar indifferent to the dynamics inside. They believed the balance of power was fixed, that my role was permanent and unquestioned. They didn't know that my quiet had shifted from endurance to calculation, and that every day from here on out was moving towards something irreversible. I went inside without a word, already aware that the next chapter of this would not be written in arguments, but in actions. If you're going to act like a landlord, don't expect gratitude, her stepbrother said at dinner, stabbing his fork into the chicken like punctuation. The table went quiet for half a second, just long enough for the comment to register, and then my daughter snorted, covering it with a cough that fooled no one. Her mother didn't correct him. She just reached for her glass and took a slow sip, eyes sliding past me as if I were a piece of furniture that had stopped matching the room. I set my fork down carefully, aware of how deliberate the movement felt, and nodded once like I'd been offered a reasonable observation instead of an insult. Within a few weeks, I would make a decision that removed me from this table entirely, but that night, I stayed seated and finished my meal in silence. That comment didn't hurt the way earlier ones had. It clarified things instead. There's a moment when tension stops building and starts settling, when you realize the worst of it has already happened and what's left is just acceptance catching up. I looked around the table and saw it plainly for the first time. None of them saw me as family in the way I'd imagined. I was infrastructure. I was the wall that held things up, the utility that ran quietly in the background. Gratitude wasn't missing because I'd failed to earn it. It was missing because they didn't believe it was required. That understanding was strangely steadying, like finally standing on solid ground after slipping for too long. Over the next several days, the dynamic shifted from subtle to overt, as if my continued silence had emboldened them. My daughter stopped asking before making decisions that affected the house, inviting friends over without warning, rearranging shared spaces without comment. When I mentioned that a heads-up would have been appreciated, she accused me of micromanaging and said living with me felt suffocating. Her mother backed her up, framing it as a generational difference, something about control issues I should work through on my own time. I listened, nodded, and made no promises. Each interaction felt less like conflict and more like data collection. 2 days later, I found a sticky note on the fridge reminding everyone to be mindful of shared resources, written in my daughter's handwriting. It referenced food, electricity, and space, all things I paid for. But the implication was clear. I was the one being asked to adjust. I stared at the note longer than necessary, then peeled it off and folded it into my pocket. That small act felt significant, not because it solved anything, but because it marked a shift. I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. I was observing patterns, tracking behavior, and quietly deciding how much longer I was willing to live inside a story where I was cast as the antagonist for having limits. That evening, while the others watched television in the living room, I sat in my room with my laptop open, not working, just scrolling. An ad for a local real estate agency appeared in my feed, bright and cheerful, promising quick valuations and discreet sales. I hovered over it longer than I meant to, feeling a flicker of something that wasn't quite resolved, but wasn't fear either. I didn't click it then. I closed the browser and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned lazily overhead. I wasn't ready yet, but the idea had lodged itself somewhere it wouldn't be dislodged. By midweek, the narrative about me had solidified into something almost rehearsed. I overheard my daughter on the phone again, telling someone that I used money to control the household and that it was emotionally exhausting to live under my roof. She said my roof, like it was an accusation instead of a fact. Her stepbrother chimed in from across the room, loud enough for me to hear. joking that at least landlords couldn't kick you out without notice. They laughed, and I felt a flicker of irony, so sharp it almost made me smile. I made a mental note of the date, not because I planned to confront them, but because I was starting to understand the timeline of how things would unfold. A friend from work asked me to grab coffee that Friday, and I agreed, mostly because I needed an external voice that wasn't tangled in the situation. We sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, and he asked how things were going at home. I gave a non-committal answer, but he pressed gently, mentioning that I seemed distracted lately. I told him, in broad strokes, about the tension, the money, the accusations. He listened without interrupting, and then said something simple that cut through all my rationalizations. At some point, being patient just teaches people they can keep crossing the line. I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. The truth of it settled heavily, and I carried it with me when I left. That night, I started documenting things more deliberately. Not out of spite or paranoia, but because clarity requires records. I created a folder on my computer and saved copies of utility bills, bank statements, and correspondence related to the house. I wrote down dates of conversations, not word for word, just enough to capture the essence. It felt clinical, almost detached, and that was intentional. Emotion had gotten me here. Structure would get me out. As I worked, I realized I wasn't angry at them anymore. I was disappointed in myself for allowing the situation to reach this point without intervention. Saturday brought another small but telling moment. I mentioned that the water bill had gone up significantly, and her stepbrother joked that maybe I should install meters on everyone's showers. My daughter rolled her eyes and said I was obsessed with control again. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not malice but certainty. The certainty that there would always be more, that my role was fixed and my patience infinite. I nodded once and said nothing. Inside, something settled into place with finality. I didn't confront her that day, and that delay, I knew even then, would cost me, but not in the way it once would have. Late that evening, after the house had gone quiet, I sat at my desk and finally clicked on the real estate ad. The website loaded quickly, clean and professional, offering free consultations and confidential processes. I filled out the contact form with minimal information, my hands steady as I typed. When I hit submit, there was no rush of adrenaline, no dramatic sense of point of no return. Just a calm acknowledgement that I was done negotiating my worth in a space I owned. I closed the laptop and went to bed, sleeping deeper than I had in weeks. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds, I realized that something fundamental had changed. I wasn't waiting for things to improve anymore. I wasn't hoping for gratitude or understanding. I had moved past the need to be seen as generous or kind by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. The escalation wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, methodical, and irreversible. They still believed my restraint meant compliance, that my silence meant I would always adapt. They didn't know that my silence now meant preparation, and that every day forward was narrowing toward a consequence they hadn't imagined yet. The sign went up on a Tuesday, planted into the front lawn like it had always belonged there, and they noticed it before they noticed me. I watched from the hallway window as my daughter froze mid-step on the porch, her phone halfway to her ear, confusion crossing her face before it hardened into suspicion. Her stepbrother leaned forward to read the lettering, then laughed, assuming it was a joke or a mistake or something temporary that didn't require concern. I didn't announce anything. I didn't explain. I just stood there, keys in my hand, feeling the weight of a decision already made. Within days, they would understand what that sign meant. But that morning, all they felt was disruption without context. I hadn't woken up planning to shock anyone. By the time the sign arrived, the paperwork had already been signed, the meetings already held, the details already settled with a precision that surprised even me. The realtor had been efficient, professional, and refreshingly neutral, never asking why, never probing into family dynamics. The house had appraised quickly, higher than expected, which felt less like a victory and more like confirmation that I'd been undervaluing more than just property. When the sign was installed, I was already emotionally elsewhere, detached from the performance of surprise playing out on the lawn. I had grieved this version of my life quietly weeks ago. Inside, The house buzzed with a new kind of energy, sharp and unsettled. My daughter confronted me in the kitchen, asking what the sign was about. Her voice pitched somewhere between accusation and disbelief. I told her calmly that I was selling the house. No qualifiers, no reassurances, just the fact. Her mother appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, already defensive, demanding to know how long I'd been planning this and why no one had been consulted. I told them I'd made the decision recently and that it was final. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I could feel the shift as clearly as a change in temperature, and I knew this was only the beginning of the fallout. They spent the rest of that day reacting in stages, cycling through disbelief, anger, and attempts at minimization. The stepbrother joked that signs came down all the time, that listings fell through, that I was probably bluffing to make a point. My daughter accused me of trying to scare them into compliance, of using the house as leverage the same way she claimed I used money. I listened to it all without interruption, noting how quickly they framed my decision as manipulation rather than autonomy. It was easier for them to believe I was cruel than to accept that I was done. I didn't correct them. Letting them misunderstand was part of the boundary. 2 days later, the first showing was scheduled. The realtor asked if the house would be empty, and I said no, that the occupants would be informed but present. I didn't do it to be petty. I did it because I wasn't going to hide anymore. The tension during that showing was thick enough to taste. My daughter sulking in her room, her mother pacing, the stepbrother making loud, sarcastic comments about open houses for occupied homes. I greeted the potential buyers politely, answered questions honestly, and excused myself when necessary. Watching strangers walk through rooms I'd paid for, imagining their future there, felt surreal, but also clarifying. This place was already leaving us. That night, after the house emptied out again, I sat alone in the living room, lights off, replaying the day in my head. I wasn't second-guessing the decision. I was mourning the fact that it had come to this at all. I thought about the version of myself who'd believed that patience would eventually be rewarded, that consistency would foster appreciation, that love expressed through provision would be understood as love. I acknowledged, for the first time without flinching, that those beliefs had kept me stuck. This wasn't punishment. It was correction of my own behavior as much as anyone else's. By the end of the week, offers started coming in, serious ones. I reviewed them quietly in my room, weighing terms, timelines, contingencies. I chose one that prioritized speed over price, something I would have once considered reckless. Now, it felt appropriate. The faster this ended, the cleaner the break. When I accepted the offer, I felt a sense of relief so deep it surprised me. It wasn't joy. It was release. I forwarded the confirmation email to myself and closed my laptop, knowing the clock had officially started ticking for everyone else in the house. The reaction was immediate and volatile. My daughter accused me of destabilizing her life, of pulling the rug out from under her without warning. Her mother said I was irresponsible, that I was forcing everyone into uncertainty because I couldn't handle criticism. The stepbrother called it a power move, a tantrum disguised as maturity. I listened to every word, standing in the doorway, arms relaxed at my sides. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't counter their accusations point by point. I simply told them the house was sold and that I'd be following the legal process from here on out. The rest would be communicated formally. That sentence alone seemed to enrage them more than anything else. Over the next several days, boxes began appearing in corners, sometimes aggressively, sometimes tentatively, like props placed in a scene no one had rehearsed. Conversations stopped altogether, replaced by sharp glances and slammed doors. I moved through the house like a guest in my own life, already emotionally detached. I ate meals alone, worked late, and spent time out of the house whenever possible. The silence that followed was heavy but clean, no longer charged with expectation. I had stopped trying to manage their feelings, and the absence of that labor was its own kind of freedom. One evening, as I sorted through old documents, I found a handwritten note my daughter had given me years ago, thanking me for always being there, for making her feel safe. I read it once and set it aside, not with bitterness, but with clarity. People change. Circumstances shift. Love expressed without boundaries can curdle into resentment on both sides. I allowed myself a moment of grief for what we'd lost, then closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. I wasn't erasing the past. I was refusing to live in it. By the time the closing date was scheduled, the house felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with furniture. The tension had burned itself out, leaving behind a brittle calm. They still believed this was temporary, that something would intervene, that I would relent. They didn't yet understand that the most important change had already happened inside me. This wasn't about selling a house. It was about reclaiming agency I'd surrendered piece by piece. I placed the eviction notice on the counter a few days later, face down, and walked away without a word, knowing the final reckoning was close, and that I wouldn't back down when it came. My daughter cried first, standing in the doorway with the notice shaking in her hand like it might dissolve if she held it loosely enough. Her mother shouted next, voice sharp and familiar, accusing me of heartlessness, of blindsiding them, of confusing legality with morality. The stepbrother waited until both reactions burned themselves out before calling me cruel, the word delivered calmly, almost thoughtfully, as if he were proud of choosing it. I stood there and listened, hands relaxed at my sides, aware that this was the moment they would later describe as proof of everything they believed about me. Within days, I would speak a truth I'd been avoiding for years, but in that moment, I let them have their accusations without interruption. The notice wasn't dramatic. It was straightforward, printed cleanly, 30 days outlined clearly, legal language doing the work I no longer needed to do emotionally. I placed it on the counter face down, not to be sneaky, but because I didn't want to perform the delivery. I'd done enough performing in this house. When they found it, the explosion was immediate, as if the weeks leading up to this had never happened, as if the sign, the showings, the sale itself had all been elaborate misunderstandings. My daughter accused me of punishing her for speaking up, of using housing the way she claimed I used money, conditional, transactional, cruel. I didn't correct her framing. I was done negotiating narratives. Her mother paced the living room, listing sacrifices she claimed we'd all made together, conveniently forgetting which account funded them. She said family didn't do this to each other, that decent people didn't turn loved ones out with paperwork and deadlines. I watched her move through the space with the confidence of someone who believed the moral high ground would eventually compel me to retreat. For years, it had. This time, it didn't. I felt a strange steadiness settle in my chest, the kind that comes when you stop hoping to be understood and start prioritizing being clear. The stepbrother's reaction surprised me less than it should have. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and accused me of flexing power because I'd lost control of the household. He framed it as a weakness dressed up as authority, suggesting I couldn't handle being challenged. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it revealed how deeply they misunderstood me. Control had never been my goal. Stability had. Respect had. And I traded both away piece by piece in the name of keeping the peace. Hearing him call it cruelty only confirmed that no explanation would ever satisfy them. I spoke then, finally, not loudly and not defensively. I told them the house was sold, the timeline was set, and the notice was not a negotiation. I explained that 30 days was what the law required and what I would honor, no more, no less. I didn't justify the sale with emotional language or dredge up old grievances. I stated facts. I watched their faces as they realized I wasn't posturing, that there was no speech coming where I'd soften or reconsider. My daughter's crying shifted from anger to something closer to panic, and for a brief moment, I felt the familiar urge to rescue her from the consequences of her assumptions. That urge passed quickly, replaced by something steadier and more honest. I told her that love didn't mean unlimited access to my resources or my life. I said that supporting her didn't obligate me to accept being disrespected in my own home. I acknowledged that the timing felt harsh to her, but that waiting longer would have meant continuing a situation that was already damaging us both. She asked if this was because of the money she'd asked for weeks earlier, and I said no, not directly. This was about patterns, not incidents. That distinction seemed to frustrate her more than any accusation could have. Over the next few days, The house became a place of negotiations I refused to participate in. They asked for extensions, exceptions, compromises that all hinged on the assumption that I would eventually cave. Her mother suggested mediation, family counseling, anything that might delay the inevitable. The stepbrother proposed financial contributions of his own, framed as proof that I'd been unreasonable to act without giving them a chance. I listened, nodded, and declined. Not because their ideas were inherently bad, but because they all missed the point. This wasn't about fixing the arrangement. It was about ending it. Boxes multiplied, not neatly, but angrily, like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to finish. My daughter oscillated between silence and confrontation, sometimes avoiding me entirely, other times stopping me in the hallway to ask if I'd ever really loved her. That question hit harder than the insults had, not because it was manipulative, but because it revealed how thoroughly the situation had distorted our relationship. I told her the truth, that I did love her, deeply, but that love didn't survive being treated as an obligation without boundaries. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language, and I realized how far apart our definitions had grown. One evening, as she packed in the living room, she accused me of choosing money over family. I corrected her gently, saying I'd chosen self-respect over resentment. That seemed to enrage her more than anything else. She shouted that I was rewriting history to justify abandoning them, that I'd always cared more about control than connection. I didn't respond right away. I let the words hang there, not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to defend myself against them. When I did speak, I said that rewriting history was pretending nothing had changed when it clearly had. Then I walked away. The cruelty accusation followed me like a shadow during those final weeks. It showed up in comments, in texts to extended family, in the way conversations abruptly stopped when I entered a room. I became the villain in their version of events, the man who turned his back when things got hard. Strangely, accepting that role made everything simpler. I stopped trying to manage impressions, stopped offering explanations that would only be twisted into further evidence against me. I focused instead on practical matters, forwarding mail, closing accounts, preparing for a life that didn't require constant emotional arbitration. On the last night before I planned to move out temporarily, my daughter knocked on my door. She looked exhausted, eyes red, anger worn thin. She asked quietly if there was anything she could say to change my mind. I told her no, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because anything short of reversing the dynamic entirely would just postpone this reckoning. I said that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is stop pretending a situation is salvageable when it's already done harm. She nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in resignation, and walked away without another word. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on how quickly the narrative had solidified around cruelty, how eager they were to frame my boundary as betrayal. I understood then that boundaries often look cruel to people who benefited from their absence. That realization didn't erase the sadness, but it stripped it of confusion. I wasn't heartless. I was finished participating in a version of family that required my silence and sacrifice as entry fees. The final boundary hadn't yet been spoken aloud in full, but it was already shaping everything that came next, and I knew that when the moment arrived, I wouldn't soften it for anyone, not even myself. I need you to listen to me without interrupting, I said, standing in the doorway on the last morning I would ever wake up in that house. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me, because I'd imagined this moment dozens of times and always pictured myself either furious or broken. Instead, I felt steady, almost grounded, like my feet were finally on solid ground after years of shifting sand. My daughter sat at the table with a half-packed box at her feet, her mother leaning against the counter, arms crossed out of habit more than hostility now. The stepbrother hovered nearby, quiet for once. This was the moment I'd been moving toward for months, even years, and I knew whatever I said next would close a door permanently. I told them I wasn't doing this to teach a lesson, punish behavior, or prove a point. I said I wasn't angry anymore, and that part seemed to unsettle them more than anything else. Anger, at least, would have fit the story they'd been telling. I explained that I'd reached a limit I should have acknowledged long ago, one where love expressed without boundaries had turned into resentment I didn't want to carry anymore. I said I had spent too long trying to be understanding while quietly disappearing in my own life, and that I refused to keep doing that just to maintain the illusion of harmony. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. My daughter tried to interrupt, telling me I was making everything sound reasonable when it wasn't, that real parents didn't walk away when things got uncomfortable. I let her finish, then told her calmly that discomfort wasn't the issue, disrespect was. I said that being called cold, controlling, and oppressive while being expected to continue funding and housing everyone had broken something fundamental in me. I acknowledged that she felt hurt and destabilized, and I didn't dismiss that. But I also said that her feelings didn't override my right to safety, dignity, and peace in my own life. That boundary, I told her, was non-negotiable. Her mother accused me of abandoning responsibility, of choosing myself over family, as if those two things were mutually exclusive. I looked at her and said something I'd never said out loud before. That responsibility without reciprocity becomes exploitation, even when it wears the mask of family. I reminded her that I had carried the financial, emotional, and logistical weight of that household for years without complaint, and that instead of appreciation, I'd been met with mockery and entitlement. I said I wasn't interested in continuing a dynamic where my value was measured only by what I provided and how little I asked for in return. The stepbrother finally spoke, saying this would follow me, that people would hear about what I'd done and judge me for it. I nodded and told him he was probably right. I said I'd already accepted that I would be the villain in their version of events, and that I was okay with that. Being misunderstood, I explained, was a small price to pay for no longer living as a doormat in my own life. I wasn't asking for forgiveness or understanding. I was informing them of my decision to disengage fully from a dynamic that had become toxic for me. Then I said the words that mattered most, the ones I hadn't softened or rehearsed. I told them there would be no more money, no loans, no emergencies, no exceptions. I said there would be no shared living arrangements in the future, no fallback plans that assumed my silence and compliance. I explained that I would always care about my daughter's well-being, but that caring did not mean sacrificing myself to preserve her comfort or anyone else's narrative. This was the final boundary, and it wasn't open for discussion now or later. The room went quiet in a way that felt different from all the silences before. This one wasn't tense or expectant. It was final. My daughter looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, not as a resource or an obstacle, but as a person she couldn't move anymore. Her mother shook her head slowly, like she was recalibrating a worldview that no longer applied. No one shouted. No one cried. There was nothing left to say that would change the outcome, and I think they all felt it at the same time. I packed the last of my things that afternoon, moving through the house slowly, deliberately, touching the door frames and walls with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. I remembered buying the place, the hope I'd attached to it, the belief that providing stability would naturally create gratitude and closeness. I didn't resent those memories. They were honest intentions, even if they'd led me somewhere painful. As I carried my final box to the car, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I was free of responsibility, but because I had finally chosen myself without apology. When I drove away, I didn't look back, not out of bitterness, but because closure doesn't require a final glance. It requires acceptance. I knew the story they would tell about me. The cold father, the controlling man, the one who chose property over people. I let them have it. My truth didn't need their validation anymore. I had spent too long explaining myself to people who benefited from not understanding me, and I was done offering clarity where it would only be used as ammunition. In the weeks that followed, the quiet of my new place felt earned rather than empty. I set my own routines, paid my own bills, and answered to no one for the first time in longer than I cared to admit. I still thought about my daughter, about what might have been different if I'd drawn lines earlier. But regret didn't consume me. It informed me. I understood now that boundaries aren't punishments. They're acknowledgments of reality, and reality doesn't bend to guilt. I wasn't cold. I wasn't cruel. I was finished being a doormat in a house I paid for, in a family dynamic that required my silence to function. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It made me honest. And if you've ever been called selfish, controlling, or cruel for finally standing up for yourself, know this. Closure isn't something you owe other people. It's something you give yourself. If this story resonated with you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, self-respect is not abandonment. It's survival. See you soon in the next story.